Right, so it's probably quite late if you're watching this, or maybe it isn't and you're just in the mood for something that moves slowly and doesn't ask too much of you. Either way, that's exactly what this is. We're going to spend the next couple of hours wandering through Breaking Bad, not recapping it, not summarizing it in the way that a Wikipedia article might, more like sitting with someone who has spent an unreasonable amount of time thinking about the show and has gradually accumulated a pile of observations they've been meaning to share with someone who'd appreciate them. The iceberg format, for anyone not familiar with it, is a way of organizing knowledge by how widely it's known. The surface is what most people already know, the basics, the famous moments, the general outline of the story. The further down you go, the stranger and more specific the territory gets. Tonight we'll start near the top, with things most fans are already familiar with, and move gradually into stranger territory. The backstory details, the production decisions, the layers of symbolism and intention that reward the kind of person who ends up watching this show 3 or 4 times and still finding new things. Each section is self-contained. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle of this, which is genuinely the intention, you won't miss a payoff when you wake up. There's no big reveal waiting at the end. There's just more of the same, a fairly unhurried look at one of the most carefully made pieces of television that has ever existed. If you enjoy this kind of thing and want to see more of it, subscribing is completely free, and it does help the channel keep going. But that's it for the admin. Let's get into it. Breaking Bad ran from January 2008 to September 2013. 5 seasons, 62 episodes on AMC. If you're watching this video, there's a reasonable chance you've already seen it, or at least you know enough about it that a full summary would feel redundant. But I want to spend a little time here at the surface level anyway, because there's something worth saying about what kind of show Breaking Bad actually is before we start going deeper. The premise, which you almost certainly already know, is this. A high school chemistry teacher named Walter White gets diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. He has a pregnant wife, a teenage son with cerebral palsy, and very little money. He decides, in response to this situation, to start manufacturing methamphetamine. He partners with a former student called Jesse Pinkman, who has existing connections to the drug trade. Things proceed from there in increasingly dark directions over the course of 5 years, and what becomes, by the end, a genuinely staggering body count. Vince Gilligan, the show's creator, described it as a story about taking Mr. Chips and turning him into Scarface. That's a clean summary of the arc, but it slightly undersells the thing that makes Breaking Bad different from other crime dramas, which is the patience of it. Most shows in this genre move fast. They're interested in the violence, the money, the status. Breaking Bad is interested in the psychology, and it is willing to spend enormous amounts of time on very small things. A conversation that goes slightly sideways, a lie that doesn't quite land, a moment where a character has the chance to do the right thing and doesn't take it. The first season, all 7 episodes of it, shortened from the originally planned 9 by the Writers Guild strike of 2007, is almost unnervingly quiet compared to what follows. It is a show about a man in the early stages of making a terrible decision, and it treats that with seriousness. You spend a lot of time watching Bryan Cranston's face. You spend a lot of time watching Walter White calculate. What I find interesting now, having watched it a few times over the years, is how quickly the show reveals its thesis and how long it takes you to actually believe it. The very first episode contains a scene where Walter, teaching chemistry to a class of bored teenagers, says, "Chemistry is the study of change." He means it as a classroom framing device. It is also, in retrospect, the most precise statement of what the next 5 seasons are about. The show is about what changes a person and how much change a person can sustain before they become unrecognizable, even to themselves. The line is in the pilot. Its full weight takes 5 years to accumulate. Breaking Bad is also, from a structural standpoint, a tragedy. Not a story about crime that ends badly, but a formally constructed tragedy in the classical sense, a person of significant capability brought low by a specific and fatal flaw. We'll come back to that flaw at some length toward the end of this, because it is really the whole show if you pull on that thread far enough. The other thing worth saying at the surface level is about the setting. The show is set in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and this is not incidental. The landscape, flat, dry, sun-bleached, with the Sandia Mountains sitting on the horizon, is central to the show's aesthetic. Everything is exposed in that environment. There is nowhere to hide. Characters do tremendous amounts of their most compromised thinking in the open desert, under a sky that offers no cover whatsoever and seems entirely indifferent to what happens underneath it. This is not a show set in a glamorous city. There's no New York skyline, no Miami neon. It is deliberately ordinary, deliberately sun-baked and functional, and the contrast between the banality of suburban Albuquerque and the enormity of what is actually happening inside it is part of what gives the show its particular flavour. One thing I notice on rewatches that's easy to miss the first time through: the show is quite funny. Not in a dark comedy way exactly, but in the sense that it has a clear awareness of the absurdity of the situations it creates. Walter White and Jesse Pinkman spend a remarkable amount of time in the early seasons dealing with genuinely mundane practical problems. How to dispose of a body, what to do about a broken down RV in the middle of the desert, how to explain certain unexplainable things to their respective families. The humour is dry and fairly quiet, but it's there, and it keeps the show from becoming relentlessly oppressive to sit with. It's one of those rare things that holds up under repeated viewings. The more you know about it, the more there is, which is the whole point of what we're doing tonight. Vince Gilligan spent 8 seasons on The X-Files. He joined the writing staff relatively early on, became a producer, and was one of the key creative voices behind a show that was, during its prime, one of the most inventive and genuinely strange things on American television. And then The X-Files wound down, and Gilligan found himself without steady work for a couple of years. Not broke, not forgotten, but without the anchor of a staff writing job, and without a clear sense of what came next. During this period, he was on the phone one day with a friend, and they were doing what people with dark senses of humour do when things are going a bit sideways, joking about desperate measures. What if they took some truly drastic action to make money? What if someone who had always played by the rules just stopped? What would that look like? What kind of person gets to a certain age, a certain point of frustration, and decides to simply burn the version of themselves they've been performing for everyone else? Gilligan has told this story in a handful of interviews over the years, and it does seem to be genuinely how the idea came about. Not a news article, not a pitch from a studio executive, not a dream, just a tired man on the phone with a friend, drifting into dark territory and following a thread that turned out to go somewhere interesting. The show was originally conceived to be set in the Inland Empire area of Southern California. Dry climate, suburban sprawl, the kind of landscape where a secret could plausibly survive for a while. But New Mexico had recently introduced a film tax incentive program offering up to 25% rebates on production spending, and the financial case for moving the production east was significant. The whole show relocated. Gilligan has said in subsequent interviews that he cannot imagine Breaking Bad existing anywhere else. The New Mexico landscape, and Albuquerque specifically, became inseparable from what the story needed. There's something about the quality of the light there, the specific kind of open indifference the desert offers, that suits a show about a man slowly becoming exactly what he actually is. California has its own aesthetic logic. New Mexico offered something drier, harder, more exposed. The pitch to AMC was not straightforward. In the mid-2000s, AMC was a network in genuine transition, moving away from its classic film library origins toward original programming. Mad Men had just been developed and was finding its audience. Breaking Bad came along very shortly after. The network was still identifying its creative identity, and a show about a chemistry teacher cooking methamphetamine was, on paper, a fairly strange bet to place. Gilligan has spoken in interviews about his general lack of confidence as a creator, which is an interesting thing to hear from the person behind one of the most technically assured television series ever made. He credits that insecurity with making him thorough. Because he wasn't certain, he triple-checked. Because he was anxious about the narrative structure, he spent more time in pre-production, building the foundation, than most shows are given. The show feels solid because the people making it were never fully comfortable, assuming it would work. The writing room was small and trusted. Gilligan describes deliberately finding the right writers, surrounding himself with people who could catch what he missed, and then spending considerable time in the room, working through questions together before committing anything to script. The show very rarely wrote itself into corners, because the writers were always thinking several episodes ahead, even in the seasons where they claimed they had no particular plan. Now here's a detail I genuinely enjoy. The name Grey Matter Technologies, the company that sits at the centre of Walter White's psychological wound, which we'll get into properly later, is built from a combination of the two founders' surnames, Walter White and Elliot Schwartz. Schwartz means black in German. White and black make grey. The show hid its central metaphor inside a company name that appears in its 5th episode, fully formed, waiting for anyone patient enough to notice it. That is a very Breaking Bad thing to do. The pieces are always there from the beginning. You just don't necessarily know what you're looking at when you first encounter them. Something else I think is interesting about the show's popularity is the timing of it, because it's an unusual case in the history of prestige television. Breaking Bad's ratings during its first 3 seasons were modest, not bad by cable standards, but not exceptional. The show grew steadily season by season, building word of mouth among people who were willing to recommend it with the slightly evangelical certainty that good things generate. By the time the final season aired in 2013, the audience had roughly doubled from where it had started. A significant part of that growth came from Netflix. The show was available for streaming between seasons, and the binge-watching model, which was genuinely new as a mainstream behaviour in 2012, suited Breaking Bad in particular. It is a show built for sustained sittings, where you can carry the emotional accumulation of one episode directly into the next, without a week-long gap disrupting the mood. The timing of its popularity, aligning with the normalization of streaming, was partly luck. The quality of the show was not. The most consistently surprising thing about Breaking Bad's casting, in retrospect, is how close it came to looking completely different. The decisions that produced the show we actually know weren't grand creative vision statements. They were mostly practical compromises and unexpected coincidences that happened to land correctly. Start with Walter White. Bryan Cranston was not the network's first choice for Walter White. He wasn't even the second by some accounts, though the precise timeline is disputed. What's clearly documented is that Sony Pictures Television and AMC looked at Cranston, at that point best known for playing Hal, the hapless and endearing dad in the sitcom Malcolm in the Middle, a role that had made him genuinely beloved and firmly associated with broad family comedy, and hesitated. We all still had the image of Bryan shaving his body in Malcolm in the Middle, one industry insider told The Hollywood Reporter. We were like, really? Isn't there anybody else? The anybody else's they found were John Cusack and Matthew Broderick, 2 names from an entirely different register of Hollywood. Neither ultimately took the role. Cusack later pushed back publicly on the story that he turned it down, suggesting the framing was inaccurate and emphasizing instead that he was never actually offered the part at all. Broderick's involvement in the process isn't much more clearly documented. The conversations happened. Then Bryan Cranston was Walter White. What convinced Gilligan, and eventually convinced the network, was a single episode of The X-Files. An episode called Drive, which Gilligan had written himself. in which Cranston played an anti-Semitic, paranoid, deeply frightening man who somehow managed to be sympathetic anyway. Gilligan watched Cranston take a character who should have been entirely unlikable and find the human being inside it without softening anything, and he understood. He has talked about this in multiple interviews. That specific performance in that specific episode made the case for everything. Cranston went on to win 4 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series for the role. No further argument is required. Now Jesse Pinkman. This is the more significant near miss in the show's history, because Jesse is arguably the show's moral centre in a way that Walter never manages to be. Aaron Paul was not an obvious choice. There were genuine reservations, including from Gilligan himself, that Paul's look was too clean, too much of a pretty boy image for a character conceived as a strung-out small-time drug dealer. Penn Badgley, who had recently risen to prominence in the teen drama Gossip Girl, was among the names considered for the role. A very different Jesse Pinkman is quite easy to imagine from that starting point. What saved Aaron Paul was his audition, and, like Cranston before him, a previous guest appearance on The X-Files. He clearly had something that translated directly to what the character needed, and once he and Cranston read together, the chemistry, there is genuinely no other word for it, was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. The part of this that most changes the show, though, Jesse Pinkman was originally supposed to die at the end of season 1. In Gilligan's original conception of the story, Jesse would be killed in a botched drug deal, somewhere in the final episodes of the first season. The purpose was to establish that the show wasn't playing it safe, that even characters who appeared central could be removed, and to leave Walter White carrying the weight of another death into subsequent seasons. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike shortened season 1 from 9 episodes to 7. Gilligan found himself with extra time he hadn't planned for, and in that time he started reconsidering. Watching the early episodes back, observing what Paul brought to the role, and what the dynamic between him and Cranston produced, Gilligan changed his mind. Jesse survived, and what was originally conceived as a two-hander with a rotating cast of supporting players became a genuine dual narrative. Hank Schrader was also on the original list for season 1 fatalities. Dean Norris's character, the DEA agent, the brother-in-law, the man whose proximity to the truth drives 5 seasons of the show's central dramatic irony, was planned to die in episode 9. He didn't. Both Jesse and Hank survived, and the entire architecture of the Breaking Bad that actually exists was built around their presence. The show we know is not the show that was planned. It's the show that grew out of a writer's strike, a change of heart, and 2 performances that were simply too good to write off early. Bob Odenkirk as Saul Goodman deserves a mention here. Odenkirk was primarily known as a comedy writer and performer, Mr. Show, various sketch projects, a background that had almost nothing to do with playing a fast-talking criminal lawyer in a prestige drama. The show was taking a genuine risk. Odenkirk repaid it by making Saul Goodman so immediately and completely alive that the idea of a spin-off emerged almost the moment he walked on set. He improvised a significant amount of Saul's dialogue, some of which made the final cut, and the trust the writers placed in him shaped the character into something richer than it might otherwise have been. Most prestige television is filmed in ways that involve a significant amount of careful fiction. Sets built to resemble cities, neighbourhoods recreated on backlots, a version of a place that is designed and controlled and consistent in ways real places never quite are. Breaking Bad did things differently. It filmed mostly on location in the actual city of Albuquerque. Real restaurants, real neighbourhoods, real motels, real stretches of open desert. The camera went to the place rather than building a version of the place on a soundstage, and this gave the show a texture that is genuinely difficult to manufacture. The White family home is a real house, sitting at 3,828 Piermont Drive in the Northeast Heights neighborhood of Albuquerque. It is a private residence and has been throughout the show's production and its entire legacy. The family who owns it was, for a while, fairly enthusiastic about the attention. They gave interviews, they allowed tour buses to stop outside. They were generally open to the whole situation. A reasonable response to finding your home in one of the best regarded television series of the modern era. Then viewers started throwing pizzas onto the roof. The pizza scene in question, if you need a reminder, is from season 3. Walter White arrives home carrying a pizza he's brought as some kind of peace offering during a period of considerable domestic tension, gets nowhere with the gesture, and in a moment of pure frustration launches the entire pizza, box and all, onto the roof of the house in one surprisingly clean arc. It lands flat. It is one of the more unexpectedly perfect visual gags in the show's run. Gilligan has mentioned it was accomplished in a single take. Fans watching this at home had the entirely predictable response of wanting to recreate it. And because the house address was publicly available and the exterior was recognizable, they went and did exactly that, repeatedly. The real homeowners eventually had a tall iron fence installed around the property. Gilligan made a public statement in 2015 specifically requesting that people stop throwing pizzas. The fence is still there. Los Pollos Hermanos, the fried chicken restaurant Gus Fring uses as the legitimate front for his operation, is in real life a fast food chain called Twister's. The location used for filming is on Isleta Boulevard Southwest. It still operates as a normal restaurant, but there's a small corner of it dedicated to Breaking Bad memorabilia, and the staff have become very accustomed to people who come in primarily to stand where Gus Fring stood. The exterior and car park are real. The interior, where the actual conversations happen, was built on a soundstage. Jesse Pinkman's house at 322 16th Street Southwest is also a real private residence and also became a tourist destination, though the owners have been considerably less welcoming about it than the White family initially were. The desert cooking location is a place called Tohajili, a section of the Navajo Indian Reservation, about 40 minutes west of Albuquerque, off Interstate 40. It's the place where Walt and Jesse drive their RV to cook their first batch, and it recurs throughout the series as the physical space where the operation exists, separate from ordinary suburban life. In the show's final season, it becomes the site of a genuinely harrowing confrontation involving the buried money and several characters who do not survive the encounter. The terrain looks almost exactly as it does on screen. It is accessible to visitors. A small number of people apparently drive out there specifically to stand in the desert and think about methamphetamine, which is a commitment. What's interesting about the show's relationship with Albuquerque as a real place is how thoroughly the city absorbed the show's identity rather than the other way around. The local film industry grew substantially in the years after Breaking Bad. The state's tax incentive program that had drawn the production there in the first place continued attracting subsequent productions, and the infrastructure built for Breaking Bad became the foundation for a broader film sector that now generates considerable economic activity for the region. There is also, as a fairly cheerful footnote, a sweet shop called the Candy Lady that sold Blue Rock candy during the show's run as a recognizable approximation of the show's fictional product. People bought it as a souvenir. The shop developed a modest products line around it. This is, honestly, one of the more wholesome outcomes of the whole enterprise. The Crossroads Motel on Central Avenue, Northeast, appeared in several early episodes as the location where Wendy, a recurring minor character, lives and works. The motel's particular atmosphere, slightly worn, a bit grim, entirely real, provided something a constructed set would have had to work hard to approximate. The Denny's used for the flash-forward scene that opens Season 5, in which we see an older Walter White in 2010 using a false identity in New Hampshire, no longer operates as a normal restaurant. Fans stop in. All of this adds up to a show that is unusually rooted in an actual place. Albuquerque is not background. it's a presence. Before every season of Breaking Bad went into production, Vince Gilligan sat down with his costume designer and his production designer and had a meeting about colour. Not a general aesthetic mood board discussion, a specific, character-by-character, arc-by-arc conversation about what each colour would mean throughout that season and how those meanings would connect to the decisions each character was making. Gilligan confirmed this directly in an interview with Vogue. The colour choices were discussed in advance, applied with consistency across every episode, and are not, despite a certain amount of skepticism from people who hear this for the first time, a case of fans finding patterns that weren't intended. They were designed. The show uses colour as a second language, running in parallel to the dialogue and action, visible to anyone who knows what they're looking for. Walter White starts the series in beige and khaki and muted greens, the palette of someone who has accepted a comfortable, functional invisibility. A man whose clothes communicate nothing about him because he has nothing he particularly wants to communicate. As Heisenberg gradually emerges over the first 2 seasons, the colours begin to darken. Black starts appearing. By season 5, Walter's wardrobe is dominated by deep, heavy tones that would look completely foreign on the man we meet in the very first episode. The shift happens slowly enough that you don't consciously register it in real time, but looking at screenshots from season 1 and season 5 side by side is quite striking. Jesse Pinkman wears red in the early seasons. Red in Breaking Bad's colour language indicates danger, violence, and criminality. Jesse in season 1 is running almost entirely on instinct, reacting to situations, operating from feeling rather than strategy, making decisions that are usually immediate and often quite bad. As his character develops across the series, as he accumulates grief and guilt, and a moral seriousness that Walter never quite manages to develop, his colour palette shifts. The progression tracks the person. Marie Schrader wears purple in almost every episode of the series. All 5 seasons, nearly every scene. Purple is historically associated with royalty, with luxury, with a desire for status and recognition that exceeds what one's actual circumstances provide. Marie wants a bigger life than she has. She wants things to be more sophisticated and more comfortable than the DEA salary and the suburban house can reliably deliver. The purple is always saying so, quietly and consistently, whether or not the scene is specifically about that part of her character. There is a further layer here if you want to go into it. Purple is the combination of blue and red, which are Skylar's colour and Hank's colour respectively. Marie sits between the 2 storylines in ways the colour passively encodes without making a point of it. Skylar White is predominantly in blue throughout the series. Cool, controlled, associated with water and depth and a kind of clear-eyed moral perception. Skylar is, for much of the show, the character who can see what Walter is becoming with the most consistency. Her blue palette puts her in visual contrast with Walter's darkening wardrobe, and the 2 palettes drift further apart as the marriage disintegrates. And then there is the fact that the meth, the blue meth that becomes Walt and Jesse's signature product, shares Skylar's colour. The thing that corrupts and eventually destroys her marriage is coded in her colour. Whether this was deliberate in quite that specific way is something the show has never quite confirmed, but the detail is there. Hank Schrader wears earth tones and denim throughout. Practical colours, grounded colours, the palette of a man who exists in the physical world and takes it seriously. Hank is, for most of the show, the character most firmly rooted in ordinary reality. His understanding of events is built from evidence and procedure. His relationship to the drug trade is professional and concrete. The colours suit him in a way that feels earned rather than assigned. Gus Fring almost always wears business casual, muted, professional, the wardrobe of managerial competence. The visual presentation of a man who runs a chicken restaurant chain and manages his region's distribution network and has nothing more interesting going on. Nothing about Gus's clothes ever suggests the person underneath them. That's the point. One specific detail worth noting: the first time Walter White puts on the black pork pie hat that becomes his Heisenberg costume, he's standing in the desert, and it's simply a hot day. It's a practical choice. For a long stretch afterward, though, the hat functions as a kind of on-off signal. He wears it as Heisenberg. He removes it when he wants to perform something else. In the final episode, the hat is present in the early scenes, and notably absent toward the end. The show finds a way to mark even that in the visual language it's been building across 5 seasons. A small bonus detail, because I think it's a good one: Walter White's name. White is his colour, obviously. Schwartz, the surname of his former business partner Elliot, means black in German. Their combined company name is Grey Matter. The two men taken together make grey. The show put its central metaphor in a character name before the first scene. Vince Gilligan wanted the chemistry in Breaking Bad to be accurate. This is a somewhat unusual ambition for a television drama, and it created an interesting set of challenges for the production. The show brought on Dr. Donna Nelson, an organic chemistry professor at the University of Oklahoma, as a science consultant partway through season 1. Her job was to check the show's chemistry, keep the scientific claims as grounded as possible, and help the writers avoid mistakes that would pull a knowledgeable viewer out of the fiction. She has given several interviews about the experience, and they're genuinely worth reading. Her original expectation going in was that she'd primarily be advising on the high school chemistry teaching scenes, the classroom material, the periodic table, the basic organic chemistry that Walter covers with his students. She hadn't quite anticipated that the show would pivot so quickly and so specifically toward the actual mechanics of drug synthesis. When it did, she adjusted her role accordingly, and the collaboration continued through the show's run. The synthesis method Walter uses in the early seasons, starting from pseudoephedrine, the active ingredient in certain cold medicines, is real and well documented. It's a known production route, which is precisely why governments had already been restricting access to pseudoephedrine-containing products for years before the show aired. When Walter later switches to a different approach, using a chemical precursor called phenylacetic acid, that too has a genuine basis in chemistry. The actual conversion process is considerably more complex and technically demanding than the show's fairly streamlined presentation suggests, but the foundations are there. The DEA also consulted on production, which is a detail that tends to surprise people, but makes sense when you think about it. They had 2 distinct interests: helping the production understand how the agency actually operated from a procedural standpoint, and this is the more interesting part, making sure the show didn't inadvertently publish something too specific. A production designer connected to the show described the DEA's involvement in a Guardian interview as partly advisory and partly something like quality control. They wanted the drama to feel authentic. They did not want it to function as a manual. Certain details were kept deliberately vague as a result of that arrangement. What the DEA couldn't fix because it was an aesthetic decision rather than an accuracy issue is the colour of the product. Walter and Jesse's methamphetamine, nicknamed Blue Sky and Blue Magic by other characters, is a vivid, translucent blue. This is perhaps the show's most iconic visual image, the thing that appears on merchandise and posters and has become inseparable from the show's identity. It is also straightforwardly, scientifically wrong. Extremely pure methamphetamine would be clear or white, not blue. The impurities that give real meth its colour, yellows, browns, occasionally pinkish tones, come from the synthesis process, and removing them would produce a colourless product. Blue is simply not achievable through purity. Dr. Nelson confirmed this in interviews. The blue was a deliberate narrative choice, with no basis in real chemistry. The product needed to be visually distinctive, recognisable in a quick shot, something that could be identified immediately on screen without explanation. Blue worked for that purpose. Real science didn't cooperate, so they decided real science could sit this one out. The prop product itself became its own separate story. Production designer Rob Wilson King, by multiple accounts, was deeply committed to making the prop look as convincing as possible. The blue rock candy used as a stand-in was so well executed that some of it disappeared from the set during production. Whether anyone involved was genuinely confused about what they were handling is not clear from the record, but the props were apparently confiscated at one point. There is a real-world dimension to this whole area of the show that Gilligan has addressed with visible discomfort in the years since it aired. After Breaking Bad became a cultural phenomenon, there were documented instances of chemistry teachers and others who drew on the show's framework in various ways. A chemistry professor at Henderson State University in Arkansas was caught producing methamphetamine in what was described in news coverage at the time as a real-life Breaking Bad. The show's commitment to scientific plausibility, always partial, always managed by the DEA consultant arrangement, contributed to a cultural moment in which the archetype of the brilliant chemist-turned-cook had an undeniable aesthetic appeal. Gilligan's intent was always the opposite of glamorization. The show was constructed from its earliest episodes to make the consequences of Walter's choices as comprehensive and devastating as possible. But intentions and reception don't always line up cleanly, and Gilligan has been honest in interviews about the fact that some percentage of the audience was not watching primarily as a cautionary tale. This is, in the end, a tension that serious crime storytelling has always carried. The Godfather has it, Scarface has it, in somewhat excessive quantity. What sets Breaking Bad apart is the degree to which it was consciously aware of the tension and tried, through the texture of its consequences, to navigate it honestly. There is a company called Grey Matter Technologies at the center of Breaking Bad's psychology, and the show introduces it in the pilot episode, but doesn't fully explain it until considerably later. By the time you understand what grey matter actually is and what Walter's relationship to it genuinely means, you're already deep into the story. The information, when it arrives in full, reframes a great deal of what you've already watched. Walter White co-founded Grey Matter Technologies with his graduate school best friend, Elliot Schwartz, at Caltech. The company was built out of their joint research, and that research eventually contributed to a Nobel Prize in chemistry. Walter brought the chemistry knowledge, Elliot brought complementary skills, and together they created something that became, over subsequent decades, worth over $2 billion. While the company was still young and finding its feet, Walter hired a lab assistant named Gretchen. She and Walter fell in love. They got engaged. Then Walter attended a 4th of July gathering at Gretchen's family home, and something cracked. He encountered a level of wealth and social ease that made him feel profoundly out of place. Not mistreated, not belittled in any overt way, just acutely aware of a gap between the world Gretchen came from and the world he occupied. He left the gathering without explanation. He left Gretchen without explanation. And he sold his share of the company to Elliot for $5,000, which he described later as a significant sum at the time. By the time Breaking Bad begins, grey matter is worth over $2 billion. Gretchen married Elliot. Walter is a high school chemistry teacher, supplementing his income with a second job at a car wash, living in a modest house in Albuquerque, unable to pay for his cancer treatment. Vince Gilligan confirmed in a 2016 interview that Walter left grey matter because of his own ego and pride, feelings of inferiority provoked by Gretchen's family, by the encounter with a wealth and ease he didn't share, and couldn't perform convincingly. He wasn't forced out, he wasn't cheated, he made a choice, walked away from the most significant professional relationship of his life, and spent the following 2 decades quietly constructing a narrative in which Gretchen and Elliot were responsible for everything that followed. This is the true architecture of Walter White's psychology, not the cancer, not the concern for his family's financial future, grey matter. The cancer is the catalyst, the thing that creates urgency and strips away the patience that had been allowing Walter to sustain his various self-deceptions. But the decision to cook methamphetamine rather than accept any of the available alternatives is not a survival decision. It is a pride decision, and it is rooted in a choice Walter made 20 years before the show begins. In the episode literally titled Grey Matter, Elliot offers Walter a job at the company and excellent health insurance that would cover his cancer treatment. Walter perceives this as charity. He goes home and lies to Skylar, telling her that Elliot is paying for the treatment. He takes drug money instead, specifically so that he can tell himself he is providing for his family through his own capability and his own genius. The fact that it's drug money isn't the relevant variable. The relevant variable is that it's his. Every subsequent exit ramp the show offers, Walter has the same structure. The DEA deal could work, but accepting it means admitting that Hank had him. Gretchen and Elliot's offer could work, but accepting it means standing in the debt of people whose success implicitly reflects on his failure. None of the exits get taken, and the reason is always some version of the same thing. Accepting would require admitting that someone else could provide something he couldn't, and that would make the grey matter decision look even worse than it already does in his private accounting of his own life. In the series finale, there is a scene where Walter breaks into the Schwartz home and waits for Elliot and Gretchen to return from a night out. He has nearly $10 million in drug money he needs to get to his son, and he has chosen to use Elliot and Gretchen as the vehicle for delivering it. Their wealth and legal infrastructure providing cover for what would otherwise be an obviously suspicious trust fund donation. He threatens them with laser sights operated by Badger and Skinny Pete, two of Jesse's friends, who are positioned in the dark outside with red laser pointers borrowed for the occasion. It is the most convoluted possible method for giving his son money. Walter knows this. He does it this way because using Gretchen and Elliot specifically, making them instruments of his final act, settles something in his own internal ledger that a simpler method would leave unsettled. It is, even at the very end, about grey matter, even at the very end, about pride. Most people who watch Breaking Bad are not consciously thinking about the score. This is, in a specific and important way, a compliment to Dave Porter, the composer who built the show's musical language from scratch over 5 seasons, and spent that time refining it into something that feels entirely native to the world of the show. Porter's influences, by his own account, include industrial electronic artists from the late 20th century. Names like Coil, Cabaret Voltaire, and Ministry sit alongside references to American minimalists like Philip Glass and Terry Riley in his discussions of the score. The result is music that doesn't sound like television music. It doesn't swell on cue. It doesn't signal emotions and then politely step back. It sits in scenes and creates atmosphere, with something that feels more like weather than accompaniment. The kind of thing you absorb without quite noticing you're absorbing it, until you watch a scene with the sound off and realize how much was actually being carried. The title theme is probably Porter's most immediately recognizable piece, a twangy percussive motif built from what sounds like a combination of acoustic percussion and electronic texture, with something slightly unsettling underneath the surface dust and grit of it. It establishes a tone in about 30 seconds that the show then maintains for 5 seasons. The piece that people who know the score tend to return to is one Porter called The Long Walk Alone, Heisenberg's theme. It is a 4-note descending motif, and it debuts in the Season 3 episode Full Measure in a scene where Mike Ehrmantraut calls Walter from across an empty field and tells him to get out of his car and start walking toward him. Walt gets out, puts on his hat, and begins to walk. The 4 notes arrive as he starts that walk. They sound, the first time you hear them, like the arrival of something that has been on its way for a while. Every subsequent appearance of those 4 notes accumulates the weight of everything that preceded them. By Season 5, when they recur in certain scenes, they carry a considerable amount of history. Porter's approach to scoring was, by his own description, deliberately non-telegraphic. He very rarely builds toward moments. He very rarely cues the audience to prepare for something emotionally. The music doesn't anticipate, it accompanies. This places an unusual amount of weight on the acting and writing because there's no musical safety net suggesting how you're supposed to feel. You watch Cranston's face and you feel what you feel, and the score is there as a texture underneath rather than an instruction alongside. One reviewer described the score as sitting in an affair with the acting, that the tension in the show comes from the binary relationship between what the music is doing and what the performance is doing, and that the two together produce something neither could produce alone. I think that's a reasonably accurate description of why certain scenes in the show land with the weight they do. The song choices, handled separately by music supervisor Thomas Golubic, are similarly deliberate and have generated considerable discussion over the years. The most talked about is almost certainly the final scene of the series finale, in which Walter White dies alone and at peace in the meth lab, and the scene plays out over Baby Blue by Badfinger. A song about a complicated kind of love, about something you wanted and finally got, and that cost you everything in the process. I guess I got what I deserved, the song begins. Whether that lyric framing is the show's most on-the-nose moment or its most precisely chosen is honestly a matter of personal taste, but the choice is not accidental, and it sits with you. The show also uses silence very effectively. There are scenes, certain confrontations in the desert, particular exchanges between Walt and Jesse in Season 4, where the score drops entirely and what you're left with is ambient sound and whatever the actors are doing with their faces. Porter has spoken about working with the sound design team on those transitions, ensuring the exit from music into silence doesn't feel like an absence, but like a shift in register, a different kind of presence. Worth noting as well, the Breaking Bad soundtrack recordings were released commercially, with Porter selecting pieces that corresponded to what he considered the most pivotal moments in the show. The score albums received positive reviews from music critics, which is relatively unusual for a television score, and speaks to how fully realised Porter's musical world turned out to be. Gus Fring is, in many people's assessment, the most completely realised villain in the Breaking Bad universe, and there's reasonable ground for the argument, even given Walter White's competition for the position. Part of what makes Gus compelling is precisely what the show refuses to tell you about him. His past in Chile is almost entirely blank, and the blanks are clearly intentional rather than the result of the writers not getting around to it. What we know, Gus Fring is Chilean. He emigrated from Chile to Mexico in 1986 during the Pinochet dictatorship. He arrived with his partner, business partner, life partner, the person who was clearly the closest thing Gus had to a home, a man named Maximino, known as Max Arquiniega. Gus had paid for Max's university education. The two of them had built something together before they ever entered the drug trade. When they approached Don Eladio, the head of a major cartel, with a product and a proposition, high-purity methamphetamine, they were doing so as genuine partners. Eladio's response was to have Hector Salamanca shoot Max in the head at the edge of a swimming pool. He did it immediately, with barely a pause, as a demonstration of power and as punishment for what he perceived as the impertinence of two unknown men approaching his operation with an unsolicited proposal. Gus was forced to watch. He was not killed. Why Gus wasn't killed is the question the show never quite answers, and the deliberate incompleteness of that answer is where a lot of Gus's menace lives. Don Eladio, standing over Max's body, tells Gus, "I know who you are." In a later scene, during a flashback in Better Call Saul, Hector Salamanca mockingly refers to Gus as Big Generalissimo. These are the breadcrumbs the show offers, placed in plain sight, without connecting them into a complete explanation. The most credible theory, which the show seems to be gesturing toward without confirming, is that Gus had a meaningful connection to the Pinochet regime, possibly intelligence services, possibly something adjacent to the CIA's documented involvement in Chilean political operations during the 1970s and 80s. Pinochet came to power in 1973 and ruled with considerable force until 1990. An American DEA agent, Kiki Camarena, had been kidnapped and killed by a cartel in Mexico in 1985, just before Gus's arrival, and the cartel had received a clear and forceful message as a result. People with American government ties were off limits. The theory is that Eladio understood Gus to have exactly that kind of protection, and chose accordingly. Giancarlo Esposito, who plays Gus, has described his own internal backstory for the character in several interviews. He carries a complete private history for Gus, involving what he's described as political royalty, a background in the world of order and institutional power, a man who came from a tradition where how things work was something you learned and applied systematically. He has said in interviews that this backstory informs every scene he plays, even the ones where none of it is explicitly referenced. Watch the performance knowing this, and a quality in Esposito's Gus becomes legible that was always there but harder to articulate, a composure that is not stillness, an alertness that never quite relaxes, the specific watchfulness of someone who has been in genuinely dangerous situations and has learned the hard way how to survive them. Better Call Saul adds texture without resolution. There is a scene where Gus, believing Hector Salamanca to be unconscious in a hospital bed, leans in and tells him a small story about his childhood in Chile, a coati that kept returning to eat fruit from a lucuma tree Gus tended as a boy. It is a quiet story, told intimately, as a kind of private taunt to a man Gus believes cannot hear him. The memory appears genuine. The context of it is entirely cold. It is one of the more unsettling scenes in either show for exactly that reason. The person telling the story is clearly a real person with a real past, and that makes everything else he does slightly harder to categorize. Any records of Gus Fring before his arrival in Mexico in 1986 simply do not exist. The show states this explicitly. When Hank Schrader questions Gus about his background, Gus deflects by noting that the Pinochet government destroyed many records. The explanation is plausible enough that it ends the conversation. It is also, quite possibly, a cover story Gus has been using for 30 years, and that everyone with the power to verify it has chosen not to contest. And then there is Max. Everything Gus builds, the Los Pollos Hermanos franchise, the industrial laundry, the meth operation, the slow and careful dismantling of the Salamanca family across 2 decades, is at its foundation for one person. Max Arciniega, killed at the edge of a pool in Mexico in the 1980s. Gus's capacity for devotion is part of what makes him dimensional. He is genuinely capable of love. He expresses it as a 20-year project of revenge, which is its own kind of statement about what grief can do to a person over a very long time. One of the more consistently surprising things Vince Gilligan has said about Breaking Bad in interviews over the years is that there was no grand plan. This is counterintuitive, given how tightly constructed the show feels, how its foreshadowing pays off with what seems like suspicious precision, how the pieces fit together with the certainty of something that was mapped from the beginning. But Gilligan has been quite consistent about this across various conversations. The writers didn't fully know where they were going. They worked season by season, and fairly often episode by episode, and they were sometimes genuinely scrambling. The most important evidence for this is Jesse Pinkman, which we've already covered in the context of the casting section, but it's worth returning to briefly here because the implications of it go beyond casting. Jesse Pinkman, the character whose emotional journey arguably carries more weight than Walter's by the final season, whose moral suffering becomes the show's conscience, was meant to be gone before season 1 ended. The show we actually have, the texture of it, the emotional shape of it, exists because a writer's strike created unexpected time and a producer changed his mind. This is not the kind of fact that usually gets mentioned in the same breath as a show's structural sophistication, but I think it actually adds to the picture, rather than subtracting from it. It means the coherence of Breaking Bad was achieved not by following a blueprint, but by a writing room that was disciplined enough and talented enough to make improvised decisions feel inevitable in retrospect. That is harder. Mike Ehrmantraut started as a one-episode character. Jonathan Banks plays him in Season 2 in what was written as a single appearance, and he plays it with such specific authority. The quiet competence, the watchfulness, the sense of a man who has made a private peace with the work he does, that the writers immediately started finding reasons to bring him back. By Season 5, he is effectively a main cast member. By Better Call Saul, he carries entire seasons. The ricin cigarette storyline is probably the best available demonstration of the show building from an improvised decision into something that feels structurally predetermined. Walter introduces ricin as a potential weapon in Season 2. The cigarette containing it is planted on Jesse in Season 5 by Walt, in a moment that completes one of the show's most quietly devastating betrayals. The cigarette then resurfaces in Season 5, finding its final purpose in the last 2 episodes. The writers have described the process of maintaining that thread across multiple seasons as partly planned and partly responsive, finding episode by episode how to keep the cigarette meaningful and present without deploying it prematurely. There's a broader principle worth articulating here. Good television writing, at the level Breaking Bad operates at, is not primarily about having a complete map. It's about having a clear enough sense of theme and character that the specific choices you make under pressure feel consistent with everything that preceded them. Gilligan and his writers had that clarity. They knew who Walter White was at a deep level, even when they didn't know exactly what he was going to do next. That knowledge held the shape of the show together across 5 seasons of improvised decisions. Now, since we're talking a bit about what the writers did with the material they had, it's worth mentioning something about Jesse's arc, specifically in the context of what the writers intended for him. Having saved Jesse from death in Season 1, the writing room appears to have spent the following 4 seasons making him suffer in compensating quantities. Jesse Pinkman's experience of the drug trade is the show's most sustained and honest portrait of what the trade actually does to people. He loses Jane. He loses Andrea. He watches a child die. He is enslaved by a group of neo-Nazis and forced to cook under threat. His suffering is not incidental to the story. It is the story's conscience, and it's delivered by a character who only exists because a labour dispute gave one man a few extra weeks to reconsider. Breaking Bad is one of the richer rewatching experiences in prestige television, and a significant part of why is the number of things the show plants considerably before their payoff. Not Easter eggs in the hidden logo or background cameo sense, structural seeds, specific details that sit quietly in one episode and then bloom into full meaning 2 or 3 seasons later. The most elaborate example of this is the pink teddy bear, which runs as a through line across all of Season 2. The season opens with a series of flash-forward sequences, shot in black and white, deliberately fragmented and disconnected from any narrative context, showing the aftermath of some kind of catastrophe at the White family home. An evidence bag, an eyeball floating in a backyard pool, what appears to be the corner of a body bag. 4 of the Season 2 episode titles are a reference to one of these images. At the time of broadcast, viewers had almost no framework for understanding any of it. The resolution arrives in the Season 2 finale. A grieving air traffic controller, whose daughter has died from a drug overdose connected to Jesse's operation, is distracted at work and fails to prevent a mid-air collision. 2 planes collide over Albuquerque. Wreckage falls across the neighborhood. The detached eye from a child-stuffed pink teddy bear lands in Walt's pool. The connection between Walter White's choices and that collision is several degrees of causation removed from anything direct. The show insists on it anyway. Walt keeps the eyeball. It appears in his possessions across multiple subsequent seasons as a visual reminder of what his existence radiates outward into the world, whether or not he acknowledges it, which he doesn't. In the season 4 finale, a very busy episode involving a bomb, a nursing home, a magnificent piece of staging, and one of the show's great villain exits, there is a brief shot of Walter's backyard that shows a lily of the valley plant growing near the fence. This appears as the episode's final reveal that Brock, the young son of Jesse's girlfriend, who Jesse believes was poisoned by Gus, was actually poisoned by Walter, using Lily of the Valley. The lily of the valley plant was clearly visible in the final backyard shot by Walt's pool. Right there. The show trusted viewers to notice or to feel the jolt of recognition on a rewatch. I don't know. The first episode contains Walter's line to his chemistry class. Chemistry is the study of change. In context, it's a classroom framing device, a teacher introducing a subject to teenagers who would rather be somewhere else. As a thesis statement for the show's 5-season arc, it is precisely correct and covers everything that follows with a single sentence. The line is in the pilot. Its complete weight takes the full run of the series to accumulate. The black pork pie hat, which we mentioned in the colour section, is another long-running plant. It first appears in the junkyard scene with Tuco at the end of season 1. The show then uses it as a visual switch for the Heisenberg persona for 4 more seasons, and the final episode's management of whether the hat is present or absent in specific scenes does quiet but specific work. Details like that only read as meaningful because of the time spent building their significance. The show also applies what Gilligan has described in interviews as Chekhov's gun fairly rigorously. If something appears on screen, it matters. The box cutter that Gus uses in the season 4 premiere to kill Victor in front of Walter and Jesse, making a point, establishing control, frightening them into a certain kind of compliance, had been visible as a prop in several earlier scenes. The magnets Walt and Jesse use to destroy evidence in season 5 are foreshadowed in the way the show handles certain earlier technological problems. The lottery ticket with the GPS coordinates of Walt's buried money, which Walt later gives to Skylar so she can trade the location to the authorities, is planted in a scene that passes unremarkably on first viewing. There's a line of dialogue in season 1 in an episode called A No Rough Stuff Type Deal, where Walt dismisses a concern of Jesse's by saying he has thought carefully about what they're doing and that he is comfortable with it. Jesse's response, like, "I choose to think I'm not the bad guy in this," is a fair description of Walt's entire psychological framework for the next 4 seasons. The show tells you what Walter is doing to himself in season 1, and then spends 4 more seasons showing you the consequences of it. The best foreshadowing in the show is the kind you only recognise on a second watch. The kind that doesn't announce itself the first time, that sits there waiting patiently to be understood. The fact that so much of it is there, placed deliberately or arrived at organically during production, is what makes the show feel, upon reflection, like something someone planned very carefully. Even though, as Gilligan has been honest about, they mostly didn't. Breaking Bad's relationship to the world it was depicting was never simple, and the show's legacy in the real world reflects that complexity in ways that range from cheerful to genuinely uncomfortable. The most immediately visible real-world effect is concentrated in Albuquerque. The city's identity, for a significant number of people worldwide, is now partly defined by the show. Thousands of people travel to Albuquerque specifically to tour filming locations. Dedicated tour buses run routes that cover the major sites. The city's tourism infrastructure has adapted to accommodate visitors whose primary interest is standing where fictional things happened, and by most accounts, this has generated meaningful economic activity for a city that was not previously a significant tourist destination. The businesses that appeared on screen have adapted accordingly. The Twister's restaurant that appeared as Los Pollos Hermanos keeps its small Breaking Bad corner and has come to terms with being primarily famous for something it hosted rather than for its own food. The car wash operates under a national brand now and maintains a quiet awareness of its place in the show's geography, and the Candy Lady's Blue Rock Candy, which started as an improvised souvenir item during the show's run, developed into a modestly established product line that was still selling when the final season aired. The White family home, as we've already covered, installed a fence to cope with the pizza-throwing visitors. This is perhaps the most genuinely representative footnote of the show's cultural footprint. The real-world objects, sometimes loudly, to being treated as a prop in someone else's fiction. On a broader level, Breaking Bad arrived at a specific moment in American cultural conversation about methamphetamine and made a distinctive contribution to it. The show did not sensationalize the drug itself, and it did not simplify its portrait of the people caught in the trade's orbit. Jesse Pinkman's experience across the show's run, the addiction, the loss, the specific kind of damage that accumulates in a person who keeps making bad choices, partly because the world around them is structured to produce those choices, resonated with people who had personal experience in that territory in ways that most television depictions hadn't managed. Social workers and people in addiction treatment communities noted at the time, and have noted since, that the show handled the consequences of drug use with a seriousness that felt different. Not sympathetic in a way that glamorized, but honestly engaged with what the experience of being Jesse Pinkman actually costs. That was noticed by people whose professional lives are spent in proximity to that kind of cost. The counterpoint, which Gilligan has addressed with visible discomfort in interviews, is that the show's aesthetic commitment to authenticity, its DEA-supervised accuracy, its glamorous production design, and the sheer quality of the storytelling combined to give the archetype of the brilliant chemist-turned-cook a cultural appeal that wasn't entirely cautionary. A chemistry professor in Arkansas was arrested for methamphetamine production in what was covered in the press as a real-life Breaking Bad. The comparison was made often enough in news coverage of drug-related cases in the years following the show's peak cultural moment that it became a kind of shorthand. Gilligan's intent was always opposite to this. He built the consequences into the DNA of the show, the deaths, the losses, the comprehensive destruction of everything Walter White claimed to value, specifically because he did not want the story to function as a template. Whether intention is sufficient when the aesthetic is this powerful is a question without a clean answer, and Gilligan has been honest about sitting with the tension rather than resolving it. What distinguishes the show's legacy from something like Scarface's, which has been enthusiastically embraced as a template by people who didn't engage with it as a cautionary tale, is that Breaking Bad's consequences are more embedded and more personal. The damage isn't external and cinematic. It accumulates in quiet scenes between people who care about each other, in choices made in kitchens and hospital waiting rooms, and car park conversations. That specificity makes the cautionary reading easier to find, even if it doesn't guarantee it. Better Call Saul ran from 2015 to 2022. 6 seasons, built primarily as a prequel to Breaking Bad, following the early career of a small-time New Mexican lawyer named Jimmy McGill, who becomes Saul Goodman, the fast-talking criminal lawyer who appears in Breaking Bad from season 2 onward and is one of its most immediately compelling presences. The show was created by Gilligan alongside Peter Gould, who had been a key writer on the original series, and I should say directly, it is extraordinary television in its own right, not merely a supplement to the original, but it is also, and this is the specific thing worth talking about here, a piece of work that changes how you understand Breaking Bad in ways that feel less like backstory filling and more like new writing overlaid on old writing. The original is still visible underneath, but reading it through what the prequel adds produces something different. The most significant reframe involves Mike Ehrmantraut. In Breaking Bad, Mike is an enigmatic and compelling figure, deeply competent, a professional's professional, operating by what appears to be a personal code that occasionally produces something resembling sympathy, even when he is clearly doing terrible things. You understand there's depth, but you don't quite see it. Better Call Saul provides it in full. Mike was a corrupt police officer in Philadelphia for years. He covered up crimes on the force, participated in a culture of institutional dishonesty, and rationalized it as the way things worked. His son Matty, a younger officer, discovered what his father was involved in and tried to hold to a version of integrity. He initially refused to play along. He was killed by other corrupt officers to keep him quiet, and Mike has been carrying that fact ever since. Every scene in Breaking Bad where Mike enforces his particular code, won't harm innocent people, won't work with anyone who raises the subject of killing children, won't leave loose ends in certain specific ways, is, after Better Call Saul, a form of penance, an act of ongoing contrition for the loose end that got his son killed. The character becomes considerably larger. The same performance is doing more work once you understand what's underneath it. Gus Fring's arc in Better Call Saul spans the years when he was building the infrastructure that Breaking Bad inherits, watching him establish the laundry, manage his relationship with the cartel, cultivate the professional trust of specific people while systematically eliminating others, handle the Salamanca situation with a patience that borders on the supernatural. It makes the Gus who exists in Breaking Bad feel even more complete. By the time you understand what Gus Fring was willing to endure, and for how long, his death in Breaking Bad's 4th season carries a weight that it couldn't have had without the prequel context. He is not simply killed. He is reached finally at the end of a very long road. Kim Wexler is Better Call, Saul's most significant addition to the universe, and arguably the most significant in the sense of changing what the original show means. She doesn't appear in Breaking Bad at all, and her complete absence from a show set only a few years after the prequel's events is now one of the most devastating elements of the entire viewing experience if you've seen both. Better Call Saul builds Kim into a fully realized character, intelligent, principled in specific ways, genuinely loving in ways that complicate everything, whose relationship with Jimmy McGill is the emotional center of the whole prequel run. What happens to her and what role she plays in what Jimmy eventually becomes transforms your reading of Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad. He is funny and quick and enormously entertaining to watch. He is also, in the light of Better Call Saul, a man carrying the particular shape of what he chose and what he gave up, and the comedy sits differently when you know that. There's also the matter of what Better Call Saul does for the Salamanca family, specifically Lalo Salamanca, who becomes the prequel's primary antagonist in its later seasons, and who is perhaps the most genuinely frightening character in the extended universe. He doesn't appear in Breaking Bad. His absence from that show, given that he is demonstrably dead before Breaking Bad's timeline and no longer present in Albuquerque, is itself a story, and Better Call Saul tells it. The two shows together form something larger than either of them separately. Breaking Bad is the story of a man becoming something monstrous, watched closely over 5 seasons. Better Call Saul is the story of a man choosing, step by step, to become smaller than he could have been, watched with equal or greater attention and considerably more heartbreak. The arcs rhyme without being identical. The universe they share has a coherence and emotional depth that very few extended narrative projects of any kind have managed to achieve. There is a version of Breaking Bad in which Jesse Pinkman is a supporting character, a version in which he dies in season 1 as originally planned, and Walter White carries the rest of the story alone, and the show becomes a purer and more contained portrait of one man's descent. That show would probably have been very good. It would not have been the show that exists, the Jesse Pinkman that actually exists, the one played by Aaron Paul across 62 episodes, and the subsequent film El Camino, is the moral center of Breaking Bad in a way that Walter White never is and never could be. Walter White's psychology is legible and documented and ultimately explained. Jesse's experience is felt. There is a difference and it matters. Jesse starts the show as a small-time drug dealer, a former student of Walter's, someone who knows the distribution side of the world they're about to enter, and not much else. He is impulsive, often irresponsible, given to self-destructive behaviour, and this is the thing the show establishes quickly and builds on, genuinely caring in a way that his circumstances have never quite found a constructive outlet for. Jesse Pinkman has a conscience. It causes him tremendous suffering. It does not stop him from making terrible choices. It tortures him for every one of those choices afterward. This is not the formula for a character who functions as simple, moral counterweight to a villain. It's more complicated than that, and the complications are what make Jesse the show's emotional engine for most of its run. His relationship with children is one of the show's most consistent and quietly devastating threads. Jesse is good with children. He cares about them with an instinctiveness that never quite fits with the rest of his life. He goes to meetings partly out of genuine connection to the other people struggling there. He becomes involved with Andrea not entirely for self-interested reasons. He is devastated by the death of Andrea's brother, Tomas, a child used by a drug operation, in a way that produces one of the show's most reckless and dangerous sequences of behaviour. Jesse decides to confront the dealers responsible alone, in a suicidal, direct approach, before Walt intercepts Jane Margolis, the woman Jesse falls in love with in Season 2, whose death becomes one of the show's central and most discussed ethical events. Walter White watches Jane die from a drug overdose that he could prevent by turning her on her side, and he chooses not to. He allows it to happen. His rationalization, to the extent he has one, is that Jane was a destabilizing influence on Jesse and was in the process of blackmailing him. These things are true. They do not make what he does less monstrous, and the show is clear about this. Jesse does not know for a long time that Walter let Jane die. He doesn't know it when he and Walt are in a relatively functional working relationship. He doesn't know it when he has, in various ways, come to trust Walt in spite of everything. He finds out in the final season, and Aaron Paul plays the moment of realization as something that goes past anger into a kind of devastation that is harder to look at. This is the moment Jesse finally understands what he has been to Walter White all along. What Jesse has been to Walter White is broadly a mirror and a conscience and a cloaking device for Walt's ego. Walt needs Jesse to be less capable, less smart, less impressive, needs him to occupy a position of dependence, because Jesse's existence otherwise raises uncomfortable questions about what Walter's genius is actually for. When Jesse demonstrates repeatedly and increasingly that he is actually very good at the work, that he has real interpersonal intelligence, that he understands people in ways Walter doesn't, that he is capable of genuine relationships with the people they do business with, Walter responds with control and manipulation and occasional violence, rather than with the adjustment that a genuinely partnership-oriented person would make. Jesse survives the show. This is important and was not guaranteed. El Camino, the Netflix film released in 2019, picks up immediately where the series finale ends and follows Jesse's attempt to escape and rebuild. It is a quiet, careful, emotionally exhausted piece of filmmaking that gives Jesse a conclusion. The show's final episode couldn't quite deliver in the space available. He gets to Alaska, he gets the false documents he needs, he leaves everything behind. Whether that constitutes a good outcome after everything he has been through is a question El Camino wisely refuses to answer cleanly. One small detail about the Jesse Pinkman catchphrases, "Yeah, bitch," and related variants, is that they started as Aaron Paul's own inventions and were not originally written into the scripts. The writers recognized what Paul was doing with the characters' verbal tics and incorporated them, eventually leaning into them deliberately. This is the same collaborative instinct that drove the Saul Goodman improvisation, and it produced something that became genuinely iconic. The Salamanca family is the engine of Breaking Bad's crime mythology, and the more time you spend with both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, the more clearly the family emerges as a kind of dark mirror to the show's themes of pride and legacy and the damage that gets passed down through generations. Hector Salamanca, played by Mark Margolis, is the family patriarch. He appears in Breaking Bad confined to a wheelchair, communicating through a small bell fixed to the armrest, capable of nothing apparently more threatening than ringing that bell at significant moments. He is the man who killed Gus Fring's partner Max in the 1980s flashback. He is the person Gus has been quietly destroying, piece by piece, for decades. Not through violence, but through the methodical elimination of everything Hector values, culminating in what is probably the most carefully designed death in either show. Hector rings his bell one last time to trigger the explosive device, taking Gus with him, dying as an act of spite rather than surrender. It is, in its way, an entirely in-character death. In Better Call Saul, a much younger Hector is a central figure, volatile, physically present, genuinely threatening in ways the wheelchair-bound version cannot be. Mark Margolis plays both versions, and the contrast is part of what the prequel is interested in. Hector was always this. The wheelchair is the consequence of a stroke he suffers, partly as a result of choices made in the prequel's timeline. Better Call Saul makes the cruelty of his eventual situation legible as a kind of justice, while also making it impossible to feel clean about. Marco and Lionel Salamanca, the cousins, are among the show's most visually arresting presences. They appear in Season 3 as assassins sent to kill Walter White, moving through scenes with a near supernatural stillness and a wardrobe of silver suits and silver-tipped boots that look slightly out of step with the rest of the show's realistic aesthetic. They are not naturalistic characters. They are more like a force of nature with a specific target, and the show uses them as such. Their ambush of Hank at a public location is one of Season 3's most harrowing sequences. Tuco Salamanca, who dominates the early part of the show and is killed before the end of Season 2, is in some ways the template for what this family produces at its most unrestrained. Raymond Cruz plays him with an energy that is genuinely difficult to watch, not because it's poorly calibrated, but because it is perfectly calibrated to a person who is both highly capable and completely unpredictable. Tuco is terrifying because you can see the intelligence behind the volatility. He is not chaotic without competence, he is chaotic with it. And then there is Lalo Salamanca, who lives entirely in Better Call Saul, but whose shadow falls across Breaking Bad in retrospect. Tony Dalton plays him as perhaps the most genuinely dangerous person in either show. Charming, patient, physically capable, and operating from a place of genuine insight about people that makes him much harder to outmaneuver than his family's general approach might suggest. Lalo smiles almost constantly. The smile never reaches his eyes. He is the Salamanca family operating at its theoretical best, which is an uncomfortable thing to watch. The family's collective characteristic is a kind of absolute refusal to accept disrespect or defeat, a pride that operates at the level of violence and cannot be managed through ordinary means. This is, of course, the same characteristic that defines Walter White's arc, translated into different cultural and professional contexts. The show surrounds Walter with a family who embody the logical endpoint of the flaw he is developing. The Salamancas are what happens when pride becomes a complete way of life, rather than a trait that can be reasoned with or suppressed. Walter is heading in their direction, and the show knows it, and it places them around him accordingly. There is a specific exchange in the Season 4 episode Hermanos, where Hank is questioning Gus about his past and asks about the Salamancas. Gus describes Hector with carefully measured contempt as a man who built nothing of worth and whose legacy is nothing but violence and damaged people. Coming from Gus, who has dedicated his own life to a 20-year revenge project, this is layered. He is correct about Hector. He is also not entirely wrong about himself. The show allows both things to be true in the same sentence without resolving them. The Salamanca family's presence across both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul gives the extended universe much of its sense of genuine continuity. They are a connective tissue, a family whose history spans the prequel and the original series and whose damage runs through nearly every major storyline in both. Lalo's absence from Breaking Bad is, as mentioned earlier, a story that Better Call Saul eventually tells, and it's a story that changes the texture of several scenes in the original show once you know it. Skylar White is one of the most interesting case studies in how audience response to a television character can tell you something significant about the audience, rather than about the character. Anna Gunn, who plays Skylar, received death threats. This is not a figure of speech or an exaggeration of the general category of unpleasant fan behaviour. She received actual death threats, serious enough that she wrote about the experience in a New York Times op-ed in 2013, during the show's final season. The piece is worth reading on its own terms. In it, she connected the hatred of Skylar to something specific about how audiences relate to women who obstruct male protagonists' desires, even when those protagonists are doing terrible things. The piece made an argument that was both careful and fairly bold, and it generated considerable discussion. Skylar's position in the show is not difficult to understand. She is a woman who gradually discovers that her husband is running a major criminal enterprise, and she responds to this discovery with a set of reactions that include horror, denial, anger, complicity under duress, attempts to protect her children, and eventually something that looks a lot like a kind of survival psychology. She is not a perfect person. She makes choices that complicate the moral picture. She is also, throughout most of the show, entirely correct in her assessment of what Walter is doing and what it will cost them. The audience hostility towards her was, by multiple accounts, something the show's creators were aware of and troubled by. Gilligan addressed it in interviews during the final season, noting with some exasperation that the audience appeared to be identifying with Walter at the expense of applying any consistent moral framework to his behaviour. He made the point that if you are watching a man who poisons children, watches women die, and destroys everyone who trusts him, and your primary frustration is with the woman who keeps trying to stop him, that's a response worth examining. What Skylar's treatment by a segment of the audience reveals, if you want to follow the thread, is something about the story we instinctively want from the anti-hero genre. The genre typically asks us to identify with a powerful, transgressive man and to find his transgressions exciting. The structure requires a world in which the obstacles to his freedom are obstacles to our enjoyment. Women who object to what the male protagonist is doing disrupt the pleasurable identification. They introduce consequences. They make the enjoyment feel less clean. This is not unique to Breaking Bad. It shows up with Don Draper's wives in Mad Men, with Tony Soprano's wife in The Sopranos, with numerous analogous figures in the crime and anti-hero genre. What's notable about Skylar is that the show itself is so clearly aware of this dynamic and responds to it so explicitly, both through Gilligan's public statements and through the text of the show, which in its later seasons makes it unmistakably clear that Skylar's position is the correct one. Anna Gunn is superb in the role, which is worth saying straightforwardly. She plays a woman navigating genuine impossibility, knowing things she can't tell anyone, protecting children she can't fully explain the threat to, staying in a situation she can't leave without the mechanisms to leave it safely, with a precision and control that matches Cranston's performance beat for beat. The chemistry between them is not the warm kind. It's the kind that comes from two extremely skilled actors who who understand that their characters are in a cold war, and it is entirely convincing. Skylar is also, at the practical level, the character who makes the money laundering plot function. The A1A car wash is her solution, not Walter's. She is better at the legitimate side of the criminal operation than Walt is, which is one of the show's quieter ironies. The man who claims to be doing all of this for his family produces the strategy, while the woman who keeps him honest produces the execution. What happens to Skylar by the end of the show is bleak. She's left alone with her children in a situation that has been made public, under investigation, without her husband, without a clear understanding of how to rebuild. The show does not give her a tidy resolution. Her final scene with Walt, where he admits the truth about his motivations, and she finally hears it directly, is the closest thing to closure she gets. And it is not comforting closure. It is the acknowledgement of something she suspected for years, that none of it was ever really about her or the children, finally confirmed out loud. Breaking Bad has one of the most distinctive visual styles of any drama series of its era, and I find it one of the more satisfying things to talk about because once you notice the recurring choices, they're genuinely everywhere. The show developed several visual habits with enough consistency that they start to feel like a signature. Most of the series was shot by director of photography Michael Slovis, who joined in season 2 and brought a distinct sensibility to the whole thing. The most talked about is the POV shot from inside unusual objects. Breaking Bad has a habit of placing cameras inside containers, appliances, vehicles, and other things that don't usually contain cameras, and then showing us the world from that perspective. There's a famous shot looking up from inside a washing machine drum, shots from inside vehicle trunks, from inside a bag being carried, from under a floorboard. The effect is partly playful, a show demonstrating that it can find interesting angles in unexpected places, and partly functional, in that it consistently reminds you that the world of the show contains vantage points other than the human ones. Things observe, objects accumulate meaning. The camera is not always a neutral eye. The time-lapse sequences are something I find genuinely interesting once you start noticing them. The show frequently cuts to accelerated sequences, clouds moving across the New Mexico sky, cities pulsing with compressed traffic, the desert doing what deserts do over time, that create moments of reflection between sequences of intense human drama. These shots function as breathing room. They also function as a comment on scale. Here are people making enormous and permanent decisions, and here is the sky doing what it was doing before and will keep doing after. The show is also remarkably interested in faces. Breaking Bad likes faces. It likes the specific muscles around the eyes and the slight shifts in expression that indicate the gap between what a character is saying and what they're actually processing. Bryan Cranston, in particular, does most of his performance in his eyes, and the show is interested in catching this at close range. Walter White lying to someone while maintaining eye contact is, at the level of the camera's attention, a genuinely detailed thing to observe. Rian Johnson, who went on to direct Knives Out and the recent Star Wars installments, directed several episodes of Breaking Bad, including Fly in Season 3, an episode that is either beloved or deeply annoying depending on where you land. On the question of whether a bottle episode set entirely in the meth lab constitutes good television, the episode is visually inventive and psychologically rich, and also about 45 minutes of two men in a room trying to kill a fly. Johnson brought a particular visual boldness to his episodes that elevated the show's generally high baseline. Michelle MacLaren directed several episodes in seasons 3 and 4 and went on to direct multiple episodes of Game of Thrones in its 3rd and 4th seasons. Her work on the show is characterized by a specific kind of controlled tension, long takes, precise staging, action sequences that are planned and executed with an almost architectural clarity. The season 4 episode Salud is probably her most admired contribution. for a sequence set in Mexico that is choreographed to operate on multiple emotional registers simultaneously. The show's visual signature extends into its color temperature and grading choices, which complement the color coding of the costumes that we discussed earlier. The desert scenes tend toward a harsh, high-contrast brightness that flattens and exposes. The lab scenes are controlled and cool and artificially lit in ways that suggest a different kind of world. Cleaner, more precise. A contained environment with rules. Interior domestic scenes use warmer, more naturalistic light in the early seasons, which gradually shifts as the household dynamics deteriorate. The visual warmth drains from the White family home across 5 seasons at roughly the same rate that the actual warmth does. Taken together, these choices produce a show that looks unlike most of what was on television at the same time, and that uses its visual language with enough consistency and intention that rewatching reveals layers that first-time viewing can only partially register. The show is made to be looked at, and it rewards being looked at carefully. Hank Schrader was supposed to die in season 1. We've established that. But it's worth spending some time with the character that survived, because Hank is quietly one of the show's most sophisticated achievements. On the surface, Hank is presented as a foil. He's loud where Walter is quiet, blunt where Walter is precise, emotionally direct where Walter is calculating. He tells terrible jokes. He collects minerals with an enthusiasm that the show uses for comedy for several seasons before quietly letting Hank's mineral collection become a metaphor for something more interesting. He exists at first as a kind of walking emblem of ordinariness, a man who is good at his job and genuinely decent and not particularly interested in examining the world beyond what that job requires him to see. This is also, of course, a cover, or not a cover exactly. Hank is not performing ordinariness. He genuinely is what he presents as. But the show is interested in what a genuinely decent, genuinely good person does when confronted with a truth that reorganizes everything they know about their life. And Hank is the show's primary vehicle for examining that question. The dramatic irony that sustains the show's 2nd, 3rd, and 4th seasons, Hank's professional pursuit of Heisenberg running in parallel with his personal closeness to the man who is Heisenberg, is one of the most efficiently deployed pieces of dramatic architecture in the show's construction. Hank comes closer to the truth multiple times before he actually reaches it. Each near miss is tightly wound. Each produces its own particular flavour of tension. And through all of it, Dean Norris plays Hank as someone who is doing his job honestly, without any awareness of how personal the job has become. Hank's PTSD storyline, introduced in Season 2 after the violent confrontation with Tuco in the desert, is handled with a sensitivity that the show doesn't always get credit for. It would have been easy to use Hank's psychological crisis as pure plot mechanics, a way of taking the DEA agent out of the active pursuit for a while, a complication to manage. Instead, the show takes the crisis seriously, shows the specific way it manifests in Hank's behaviour and his marriage, and connects it to a larger portrait of what it costs a person to spend a career in proximity to violence. Marie's response, patient, occasionally frustrated, fundamentally loving, is one of the show's better depictions of how people navigate a partner's mental health struggles without making them purely about the caregiver's burden. The moment when Hank finally connects Walter to Heisenberg, reading Gail Boetticher's copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, finding the inscription to WW, my other favourite WW, sitting on the toilet in Walter's house, is, structurally, one of the show's most carefully prepared events. The clue has been in plain sight. Hank has handled Gail Boetticher's lab notebook before. The WW reference has been mentioned in Gail's lab notebook Hank himself has read. The show places all the pieces in a logical arrangement, and then gives Hank the moment when they connect. And it lands with the weight of something that was always coming. What follows? The garage confrontation between Hank and Walter in the Season 5 premiere of the second half is the show at the height of its powers. Two men in a small space, both of whom understand the situation completely, with no audience and no intermediaries. Cranston and Norris are extraordinary together in that scene. Every pause carries weight, every partial sentence. The moment when Walt tells Hank, with complete calm, that he has terminal cancer and that there's a good chance he'll be dead before Hank can ever put him away, and that this might be something Hank wants to take into account, is genuinely chilling in a way that the show earns because it has spent 3 seasons building Walter into someone capable of saying something like that and meaning it. Hank dies. He is executed in the desert in the season 5 episode Ozymandias, which is generally considered one of the best single episodes of television produced in the 2010s, and possibly of all time. His death is not presented as heroic in the conventional sense. He does not go out on his own terms, exactly. He refuses to beg and refuses to negotiate and refuses to give Walter anything, which is its own kind of dignity. But he dies in the dirt while his brother-in-law stands nearby and fails to save him, and the show does not aestheticize the moment. It is simply what it is. Dean Norris, for what it's worth, was initially best known for relatively straightforward, tough guy roles. The depth he brings to Hank's later seasons, the vulnerability, the PTSD sequences, the late season reckoning with who Walter actually is the same kind of surprise that Cranston and Paul before him represented. The show had a specific genius for finding what an actor was capable of past the image they'd established. Fly is a season 3 episode of Breaking Bad that divides people fairly cleanly. It takes place almost entirely within the meth lab. The plot, such as it is, involves Walter and Jesse attempting to kill a fly that has entered the lab and that Walter believes constitutes a contamination risk. That is essentially the entirety of the external action. No cartel, no DEA, no family drama, just a very clean room, 2 men and 1 fly. The episode was directed by Rian Johnson, written by Sam Catlin and Moira Walley-Beckett, and shot in a way that makes a fundamentally static situation look visually varied and interesting for its full 47-minute runtime. It is deeply loved by a segment of the audience and deeply resented by another, and the disagreement is fairly revealing. The people who dislike Fly tend to dislike it on the grounds that nothing happens. They want the plot to advance. They want the tensions that have been established in the surrounding episodes to develop. They find a long chamber piece about a fly frustrating when they're in the middle of a story this large and this carefully wound. The people who love it tend to love it because it is doing exactly what it looks like it's doing and doing it with unusual skill. The fly is a contamination. Walt's obsession with catching it before it can compromise the product is also his obsession with controlling every variable, with maintaining the fiction that what he is doing is precise and professional and under his management. The conversation he and Jesse have during the episode, circling around things neither of them can quite say directly, coming close several times to the truth about Jane, about what Walt has cost Jesse, about the nature of their arrangement, is some of the show's most carefully written dialogue. It does what great dialogue does. It reveals what the characters are thinking through what they choose not to say. Breaking Bad has a broader philosophy of restraint that Fly exemplifies in its most concentrated form. The show consistently prefers the interior to the exterior. A conversation between 2 people in a small room typically does more work than an action sequence. The violence in the show, when it comes, is impactful partly because it has been delayed and anticipated for a long time before it arrives. The show earns its moments by not spending them casually. This connects to something that gets discussed in the context of the show's quality, but is sometimes imprecisely articulated. Breaking Bad trusts its audience in a very specific way. It trusts them to sit with discomfort, to stay in a scene past the point where something has been established, because the additional time is doing something that the quick cut would eliminate. To accept that an episode about a fly is actually about something considerably larger than a fly, without the show explaining that explicitly. Vince Gilligan has cited showrunner anxiety as one of the drivers of his approach because he wasn't certain the audience was following. He was inclined to check and double-check the foundations before building the next floor. This anxiety produces, paradoxically, television that trusts its audience more than most. The checking is done internally, in the writer's room, and what emerges is work that has thought through its implications rather than work that explains them. Fly is the episode where that philosophy is most exposed and most concentrated. If you like it because it shows you exactly what kind of show Breaking Bad thinks it is. If you don't like it, you're probably watching for slightly different reasons. Neither response is wrong, but the episode is not an accident, and the people who made it were not confused about what they were doing. The title is a piece of regional slang from the American Southwest. To break bad means to go wrong, to turn toward trouble, to step off the legitimate path in favour of something more chaotic. Vince Gilligan has talked about it in interviews. It's colloquial, used conversationally, and it suited the story he was telling in a fairly direct way. But the title works on multiple levels that the show genuinely earns over 5 seasons, and the deepest of those levels is worth spending some time with. Werner Heisenberg, the physicist whose name Walter White adopts as his criminal alias, formulated what became known as the uncertainty principle. It holds that you cannot simultaneously know both the position and the momentum of a particle with perfect precision. The more precisely you attempt to measure one property, the less precisely you can know the other. There is a fundamental uncertainty built into the act of observation at the quantum level. You cannot have complete knowledge of both quantities at once. The show never explicitly reaches for this as a metaphor. It doesn't need to. The name is enough for anyone who wants to follow the thread. Walter White is a man who cannot be fully known, not by Skylar, not by Hank, not by Jesse, not by anyone who encounters him. He behaves differently depending on who's watching. He has constructed versions of himself with such thoroughness and for so long that even he has lost clear track of which is the real one. Apply the uncertainty principle to a person. The more closely you try to observe him, the less certain you become of what you're actually seeing. And alongside that, there is the question the show circles throughout its 5 seasons, a question Gilligan has articulated in exactly these terms in various conversations, of whether Heisenberg is something Walter White became, or something he always was. Was he a decent man corrupted by impossible circumstances, by a cancer diagnosis and financial desperation and the seduction of competence? Or did the cancer and the diagnosis simply remove the barriers that had been keeping an existing personality contained? The show argues, through the weight of 5 seasons of accumulated evidence, that it revealed him. The finale provides an answer in direct, unambiguous language. "I did it for me," Walter tells Skylar in the final conversation they have before his death. "I liked it, I was good at it, and I was alive." 5 seasons of elaborate self-justification, the architecture of a man who had constructed an entire moral framework around protecting his family and preserving his dignity, are set aside in 3 sentences. Not the family, not the cancer, not the money, him. He wanted to feel capable and respected and genuinely excellent at something. He found a context in which he could feel all of those things, and he chose it, and he kept choosing it long after the original justifications had dissolved into irrelevance. The flaw, as the grey matter section covers in detail, is pride. What's worth adding here is the formal framing. This is a tragedy in the classical sense, and the mechanics of the tragedy require that the capacity and the flaw be commensurate. Walter White was genuinely brilliant. The flaw destroys something that was actually worth having. That's what makes it a tragedy, rather than just a crime story with bad consequences. There is something that I think is worth sitting with here, which is how recognisable the logic underneath Walter's choices is. even when the choices themselves are not. The specific emotional architecture, the wound that becomes a motor, the story you tell yourself about why you're doing the thing you're doing, the self-narrative that positions you as the aggrieved party in situations where you are the one who made the choices that produced the outcome you're now aggrieved about, is not something most people encounter at the scale Walter operates at. But the logic itself, the logic is familiar. The refusal to receive, the compulsion to provide, the pride dressed up as love, or duty, or necessity. That part is human enough to be uncomfortable. The show knew this. Gilligan has said in interviews that he and his writers were aware they were asking the audience to recognize something of themselves in a man doing monstrous things, and that the recognition was part of the point, not to implicate viewers in the crimes, to suggest that the psychological material Walter White is working with is not as exotic or as other as we might prefer to believe. Breaking Bad is a tragedy in the proper sense, a person of genuine capacity brought low by a flaw that was always there. The flaw is pride. The tragedy is that the capacity was real. He was brilliant. He could have done something worth remembering. He chose instead to be feared and then died for it. And by the end he knew exactly what had happened and said so plainly. There's a kind of clarity in that, I think, even if it's entirely cold. And that's most of it. There is always more with a show this dense, the complete arc of the methylamine heist and what it reveals about the show's relationship to planning and failure, the specific ethics of Mike Ehrmantraut's code and where it ultimately fails him. The question of what Walt Jr.'s experience of his father's revelation means in a show so focused on the adult generation's decisions. Any of those could be their own evening. As a walk through the iceberg, though, I think we've covered the significant ground. The surface, what kind of show this is, what it's actually doing with its premise, the origins, how it got made, the conversations that started it, the tax incentive program that gave it its landscape, the near misses, who almost played Walter White, why Jesse Pinkman still exists, what the show almost looked like, the real places, Albuquerque, the pizza house, the desert, the layers of visual language in the colour coding and the camera work, the chemistry question, the grey matter wound, the score, Gus Fring's blank past, the improvised decisions that produced a show that feels designed, the archive of foreshadowing, the real world's complicated relationship with the fictional one, what Better Call Saul did to it, Jesse's conscience, the Salamancas, Skylar and what her reception revealed, The Fly, what the title actually means. Breaking Bad is one of those things that rewards continued attention in a way that very few pieces of storytelling manage. The more you know about it, the more there is. That's a reasonably good description of most worthwhile things. If you're still awake, thank you for spending this much of your evening here. And if you're not, that was rather the intention. More of these are planned. A few topics I'm keen to do in this format, some television, some film, some things adjacent. If you're subscribed, you'll find them when they arrive. For now though, get some rest. End of script. A few things that didn't fit neatly into earlier sections but are worth knowing. The show, that's a significant number, though the number that matters more in context is the 3 that Bryan Cranston won consecutively for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series, tying the record at the time for a drama series actor, and a monument to how completely the performance defined the show. The performance defined the show. Walter White's birthday is September 7th, 1958. He dies on September 7th, 2010, his 52nd birthday. The pilot episode, set in the 2-year span of the show's timeline, ends where the birthday does. Eileen ends where the birthday. The show's opening titles use element symbols from the periodic table to highlight letters in the title and cast names in all seasons. Episodes content in some seasons. The main title sequence overlays the atomic symbols for bromine, Br, and barium, Ba, in the words breaking and bad. The periodic table sits underneath the show's identity in a way that extends past the classroom scenes. Bryan Cranston directed the Season 3 episode No Mars, which was the season premiere. Directing an episode in which you are also the lead actor, on a show running at this level of intensity, is a non-trivial undertaking. Cranston has spoken about the experience in interviews and described it as both exhausting and valuable for deepening his understanding of the material. The show was initially turned down by several networks before AMC picked it up. HBO passed. FX passed. AMC, which had just developed Mad Men and was actively building its prestige drama identity, saw what Gilligan was offering and said yes. It is fairly standard practice in television industry retrospectives to note that the networks which passed must have certain feelings about this now. Aaron Paul and Bryan Cranston have maintained a close friendship since the show ended, which is either heartwarming or slightly ironic given the dynamic their characters occupy. They have appeared together at various events, collaborated on a mezcal brand, and by all accounts genuinely enjoy each other's company. Jesse and Walt's professional relationship destroyed nearly everything it touched. The actors who played them apparently got on very well. The final episode of the series is called Felina. The word is an anagram of finale. It is also the name of a character from the Marty Robbins song El Paso, which plays in the opening scene of that episode, and which is about a man returning to a place he loves, knowing that it will kill him. The episode was writ, had planted the anagram in the title, acknowledged it cheerfully when fans noticed it, and has never confirmed that the chemical symbol reading was intentional. Both meanings were intentional. One more detail I find genuinely pleasing. The show's prop department created a real label for the Los Pollos Hermanos chicken restaurants, with a proper logo, menu design, and brand identity. The fictional restaurant had complete brand guidelines. This was partly production necessity and partly the show's general philosophy of building things properly, even when shortcuts were available. The brand has since appeared on licensed merchandise, and there have been actual pop-up Los Pollos Hermanos experiences at various events and promotional tie-ins, which means that a fictional brand invented for a television show about a drug kingpin's fast food front business became, for limited periods of time, a real business. This is a strange and very 21st century footnote to a very 21st century cultural phenomenon. The show's writers also famously kept a whiteboard in the writer's room throughout production that tracked open storylines, character states, and unresolved plot elements. Photographs of the board from various points in the process have circulated online and are interesting documents of how the storytelling actually worked at the mechanical level, what questions were live at any given moment, what consequences were pending, what threads needed eventual resolution. It is, in a way, the most transparent possible view into the architecture of the thing.